Hey everybody, welcome back to the Rusty Rolex Repair. This is part 2. If you haven't seen part 1, we covered that in last week's video, so go check that out. I'll put a link in the upper left corner or upper right corner of this video. You can go back and take a look at part 1. Today in part 2, we're going to remove a little bit of rust using the laser engraver. I'm going to do that here. You can see I've got it set up so that it's only going to laser the surface, and what I'm doing here is just setting it up on a slow and light burn so that it just burns the rust away. It'll make it easier when I go ahead and polish this part up, because after doing the rust removal, I'm going to actually have to go back and beat this up with the polishing machine. So here you can see I'm just doing the mainspring barrel, which was the worst. I'm trying to save as many parts as I can here, and if I can get these cleaned up, I won't have to replace them, although I do have a spare barrel. Here, I'm just doing the lid very lightly, and I'm going to go ahead and do the rotor because the rotor was pretty bad too. Again, I'll polish these up when I'm done. You can see how well that laser works. So here's all the parts that I have in pieces. The whole movement's been disassembled and it is spread apart. I've actually gone ahead and cleaned everything up and started assembly on the watch, but we're going to go ahead and finish it up here. Well, we're not going to finish the whole thing up. That'll come in part 3. So let's take a look at some of the parts that we're going to replace here. There is the escapement wheel that was original, and here's one of the main ratchet wheels for the rotor system. This is the cleaned up stem that I have. I do have a new stem somewhere. There's the old click. That's the click on the ratchet for the mainspring. And then we've got the old center pinion and cannon pinion here. You can see they're not in very good shape. I did even try cleaning these up. I figured I'd just go ahead and replace them. So here's a new ratchet wheel. You can see the rust and missing teeth on some of these gears. It was just obviously better off to go ahead and replace it. There's a new click spring, a click screw, and the new click for the ratchet wheel for the mainspring. And I've got a new center and cannon pinion. There's our new escape wheel, and you can see here's the parts there that I'm going to need for this. That's actually the new click spring and screw. There's our new stem for the crown. The crown is in very good shape, so we're just going to leave it, clean it up a little bit. And there's the main wheel off the mainspring. I do have that coming. It didn't show up in the mail, so we're going to go ahead and get that in here and put it all in place here. So let's start by putting the rotor assembly back together. So here, these are the oscillating wheels that self-regulate so that the rotor will actually wind the mainspring in both directions. We're going to get those in place. They're all cleaned up or parts are replaced. And now we'll put the plate on top of that. This plate did have a little bit of rust on it. You can see I'm not going to go ahead and nickel plate that just because it's not worth it. Part is working. It's in good shape. We just cleaned and polished it up a little bit. So we'll get that aligned. A little bit of shakiness. I think I had a little bit too much coffee the morning I did this. And we'll just tickle all these pieces till we get them lined up. Once they're lined up, I'm just going to hold them gently in my fingers, and we'll put the screws in place. There are 3 screws that hold this plate onto the rotor system. Very, very tiny screws, so just be careful with them. You don't want to lose them. We'll get them all lined up. Again, 3 screws, get everything in place, tighten it all down. Going back to that laser engraver, rust removal is kind of a satisfying video to watch. So here I'm just testing everything, making sure everything works smoothly and cleanly, and it does. We'll go ahead and put the rotor on the rotor assembly. Get that all straightened out. There's a C-clip or a circlip on that, as well as a gear that holds it in place. I think I forgot to record that, but let's see if it shows up here. Just going to give it a little bit of oil just before I do the final assembly of the rotor system. That way I don't forget later. Give that center jewel, that upper jewel, a little bit of oil. We are using the original rotor, so we just want to keep things all lined up. Now, this is the fun part for me. I like to always pre-test my balances. I've gone through, pulled all the balance jewels out, cleaned the balance staff, cleaned the balance jewels, put everything back together, and I like to test this all up so that we can see if there's any friction left. If there is any friction left, we can go through and polish things up a little bit better. So first thing I'll do is, once I get somewhat assembled here, I'll test the balance, make sure that it moves freely, and I'll check it both upright and face down just to make sure that everything is smooth. If I'm pretty happy with that, what I'll do is I'll put the screw in, and that's what I'm doing here, and that's going to seat the balance cock with the balance in place just a little bit tighter. That way I can make any adjustments. If I need to make them, I can make them now. There is a level adjustment or a height adjustment on the balance cocks on most Rolex watches, especially anything made after like 1982. So you do have a little bit of play if you have to maneuver these a little bit so they're not so tight. Once I'm satisfied with the freeness of the balance wheel, I can go ahead and remove that and put that back in the parts tray. And we'll put that back on when we do our mid-range assembly. Again, you're going to just gently remove this, place it off to the side, and we'll go ahead and put that in our parts tray. Now I'm going to tackle the mainspring. So we're going to put a new mainspring in this watch. I've cleaned up the mainspring barrel, polished it all up, got a new arbor, mainspring barrel arbor so that we can get rid of the old one that had some corrosion on it. I'm going to put a little bit of mainspring grease in there and just get the mainspring seated. I apologize for being off cue with the camera. I get a little tied up with myself here just getting stuff done, and I always forget that I am recording these because I like to move a little bit on the quicker side. Once that spring's in there, we'll put the arbor in, and then we'll put the cap back on the mainspring barrel. So get that arbor in, make sure it's seated correctly, make sure the little notch is in the center hole of the mainspring, and then we can get that plate on. So I'm just going to twist this around, make sure it's seated correctly before I progress to the cap. Now you can see I've got the cap on. I'm just going to snap it shut with my fingers. That's all you have to do. There's no tools needed for most of these. Some of the old pocket watches, like the pocket watches, especially the Swiss pocket watches from like pre-1900, those were pretty hard. You needed a good pair of parallel pliers to clamp those in place. So let's start getting this thing put back together. I'm just going to seat the barrel and make sure that it seats correctly, that there's no rubbing or anything on that. I'll get that center pinion back in place. We'll seat the bridge for that. Make sure that the jewel's nice and clean. And just get that tapped down. What you're doing here is just making sure that it's sitting in the jewel correctly before you go ahead and put the screws or tighten anything down, because you can crack those jewels if those things aren't seated very well. Once I know it's seated correctly, I can tighten the screws down, and we'll move on to the next step. Everybody has their own procedures or process of putting a watch back together. This is kind of my process. It doesn't have to be yours. Here I'm going to put the new escape wheel in. We'll put the new main wheel in there. And I'll get the center wheel for the second hand. And the third wheel goes right there. So we're going to get those all in place. And we'll get the quarter bridge on, which holds everything in position. Now, this is a little tricky when you're doing this. Just remember that what you want to do is get those pinions and the staffs in the right place, because you don't want to crack any jewels. You don't want to do any damage to any of the staffs. So you're going to just gently put that back together. Get the screws about halfway down so it's just holding the bridge in place. It's not clamped onto any of the gears. And now we'll go ahead and just tickle up all the gears, just gently tickle them back and forth until they fall into position. Sometimes I do this off camera. I'll do it under the microscope just to make sure that I'm not going to cause any damage. You do a little tweaking here and there, and eventually everything falls into place. There's always that one time where you put everything together and put the bridge back in and everything just falls in place all by itself. Those are the good days. Once we get it all seated, we'll go ahead and just test everything and make sure. If it's not moving correctly, then we'll go ahead and just take this under the microscope and line all those gears all up together. Now that everything's seated, I'm going to go ahead and just test everything. You can see if I put a little pressure on the third wheel, everything moves nicely and smoothly. And I'll go ahead and tighten up those 2 screws that hold the quarter bridge in place. Once that's done, we're going to move on to the stem and the clutch system. Now I've pre-assembled most of this, and now I'm just going to put in the clutch and the winding gear on the clutch that attaches to the stem. We'll get that seated in correctly. Sometimes you have to tweak the gear, the little snaps on the front, the little springs, and get that seated correctly. I'll insert the stem very gently and get that lined up. Once it's about halfway in or just about in the hole, there's a little receiving hole for the bottom of the stem that keeps it lined up. I can push down the indent and get that seated correctly. And it's always a good idea just to check and make sure that everything is working properly as you go along. So here you can see I'm just testing the stem to the first and second position just to make sure everything moves and operates properly. Now we'll work on to the barrel bridge. The barrel bridge has had some damage. Remember, the click was rusted completely in place and the screw was damaged. I did manage to get that out. So we've got a new click spring, a new click, and a new click screw, or the screw that holds the click in place. So we'll get this lined up, get that click spring in position. There's a small indent there to hold or receive the click spring. Keeps it in the right position. Now here you can see I'm using a small driver, and I'm going to just kind of use my tweezers with my right hand and just get that seated correctly. If you've never done this before, it'll take a little bit of practice. But once you get the hang of it, you can usually get these in relatively quickly. And to be honest with you, it's a little slow getting this one in, but it finally seated correctly. Now I'll put the new click on. And this click is that little ratchet sound that you hear when you wind the mainspring with the crown. Believe it or not, it does make a clicking noise when the watch is winding. You just don't hear it because it's so slow and shallow of a sound. I'll get that screw in place to hold the click onto this bridge, the barrel bridge. And I'm a little out of focus here, but you get the idea. Once that's done, we'll just tighten up that screw and make sure that the click works by testing it. This is a self-aligning click, so once you get it in place, the spring will be held in. It'll just work. There's a little tab on that click that hits that spring, and you can see it just kind of flops back. Now we'll put the barrel bridge back in place onto the watch movement. Just make sure you line it up correctly. This is probably the easiest bridge to work with. There are 3 screws that hold this in, and I usually just tighten the middle screw down and make sure that everything works as I'm progressing along. Once you're satisfied, you can put the other 2 screws in, tighten them down. Luckily on a 30-35, you only have just the barrel that's being held in place. With that done, let's go on to the next step, which would be to put the ratchet wheel onto the mainspring barrel. Now, this is the gear that makes works with that click to make the clicking noise, and this gear actually holds the mainspring in position. That's the purpose of the ratchet. Once you get that aligned right, you can put the screw in. This is a standard threaded screw. I'll give that a little whine and just make sure it tests here. And everything turns well, we're in good shape. Off to the next step, which is to get the pallet put in place. So here's our pallet fork. Pallet fork wasn't damaged, thank God. Those can be like $75 when you're looking for them sometimes. When you don't need them, they're cheaper. And here's the bridge for the pallet fork. So we'll get that lined up and put in place. Now the pallet fork is a very, very delicate part. So what I'll do here is just line up the bridge very carefully. And I'm not going to put any pressure on it. Just going to line it up. And there's 2 little tabs that this falls into. 2 little screw holes for 2 screws. We'll get those screws in place, tighten them about 3/4 of the way down so that there's still a lot of play between the pallet fork and the movement. time to sharpen my screwdriver. Well, once you get one screw in, you're going to move on to the next one, and you're just going to tighten that down about 3/4 of the way. Again, leaving enough play so that you can tickle the pallet fork back and forth and seat it into the jewels. It does have an upper and lower jewel. And once you get that all seated correctly and everything works well, just go ahead and tighten up those 2 screws. Give it a little bit of oil. I usually oil as I progress along just to make sure that I don't forget to go back or make it difficult to go back later. Now I'm just going to put the balance cock and the balance in place. We'll get that seated correctly, lined up with the pallet fork, and seated onto the movement. Again, you're going to be very careful when you're putting this in because you don't want to cause any damage. Going to give it a quick test, make sure everything's working good. So far, so good. And that's what I like to see. I like to see the movement running really well. That's it for this video, guys. Part 3 is going to cover the rest of the assembly and finishing up this watch. I do not have a band to work with in the bezel. The customer kept the bezel, so we're going to bring the watch back to him without the bezel, but everything should be done and working in the next part 3. If you like this video, please like and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the next video or the final part of this project. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.